6 days before she disappeared, Lynette Hooker pointed her camera at the water. Dark skies. The kind of clouds that sit low and heavy over the ocean. Choppy water moving beneath the hull. And Lynette, somewhere behind that camera, alive. She wrote the caption herself. Here we are at Marsh Harbor. The Sea of Abaco is very entertaining. That was March 29, 2026. By April 4, she was gone. Her husband says she fell from a small boat in the dark. He says the water and the wind separated them. He says he tried everything he could. But there is a problem with that account. His phone was running a navigation app that night. A marine tracking app that recorded everything, every position, every heading, every stop, every return. A digital log that exists completely outside of anything Brian Hooker has said to anyone. And what that data recorded does not match his story. Not in one detail. Not in two. Not in any way that investigators have been able to reconcile with the account Brian gave police on the morning of April 5, 2026. This is the case of Lynette Hooker. And it is far from over. Before we go further, this case involves the real disappearance of a real woman. A mother. A professional. Someone who gave up a career and a home and everything she owned to build a life she believed in. What federal investigators now believe happened to her on the night of April 4 is something her own daughter saw coming long before anyone else was paying attention. If you are new here, this channel is built for exactly this. The cases the news cycle moves on from. The family's still sitting with no answers. The investigation still running in real time. Subscribe now and drop your city and country in the comments below. Lynette's family needs to see how many people around the world are still paying attention. Now, let us start from the beginning. Lynette Ruth Hooker was born in 1970. She grew up in Michigan. She was a woman who built things, a career, a family, a life that most people would look at and call stable. She worked in telecommunications for years, holding positions at Michigan Bell, then Ameritech, then SBC Telecom. These were not small jobs. These were decades-long professional commitments in an industry that took real skill and real consistency to move through. She had been married once before, to a man named Rick Aylesworth. That marriage lasted 5 years. In 1997, she had a daughter from that relationship, Carly Aylesworth. Carly was Lynette's child, not Brian's. That distinction matters later. In the year 2000, Lynette married Brian Hooker. For years, the couple lived a conventional life in Kentwood, Michigan, and later in Onstead, near Sand Lake in the Irish Hills area of Lenawee County. A brick bungalow on a lakefront lot. Neighbors nearby. A community that knew them, at least from the outside. A former neighbor from Kentwood described Lynette as just a sweetheart. Someone with a go-with-the-flow quality about her. A free spirit, in the way that phrase actually means. Something, not as a cliché, but as a genuine description of how she moved through the world. She waved at people. She was warm. She was present. That is who she was before the boat. But at some point, Brian and Lynette made a decision that would change the shape of their lives completely. They decided to leave it all behind. The house. The careers. The routines. They were going to buy a sailboat and live on the water. Lynette quit her job. She sold her house. She gave away everything she owned. She did all of that to go sailing with Brian Hooker. And what happened on that boat, what really happened between the two of them once they were out on the open water together, is something that started surfacing long before April 4, 2026. To anyone watching the Sailing Hookers online, Brian and Lynette Hooker looked like a couple living the life most people only dream about. They had a YouTube channel, an Instagram account, a TikTok page. All 3 platforms running under the same name, the Sailing Hookers. Videos of tropical water, calm anchorages, beach stops, lobster dinners, snorkeling in clear shallows. The comments were full of people saying they wanted that life. That they envied the freedom. That Brian and Lynette had figured something out that the rest of the world had not. But what the camera captured and what Lynette was actually experiencing were not the same thing. In January 2024, Lynette reached out privately to a close friend and fellow sailor named Marnie Stevenson. Marnie and her husband Blaine had met the Hookers in 2023 while sailing through Florida. The 4 of them had become close, the kind of close that comes from spending time together on the water, sharing the same ports, the same lifestyle. In those private messages to Marnie, messages that were later obtained by CBS News, Lynette wrote that the marriage had not lasted 6 weeks of sailing before it fell apart. 6 weeks. After years of planning. After quitting her job. After selling her home and giving away everything she owned to fund this life with Brian. After all of that, 6 weeks on the water together, and Lynette told her closest friend that it was real bad. That she could not be out there with him. She left. She packed what she had and went to stay with her mother in Florida. She told Marnie she was done. That she was not going back. And then, approximately 1 month later, Lynette reconciled with Brian. When Marnie reached out to check in, Lynette responded with heart emojis and a thumbs up. She went back to the boat. Back to the man she had just told her closest friend she could not be out there with. That reconciliation happened in February 2024. 2 years before April 4, 2026. And it was not the only documented tension in this marriage. Neighbors in the Onstead community described years of conflict. Jordan Plentz, 29 years old, who lived directly across the street from the Hookers, told the Detroit News that the marriage was turbulent. A long history of fighting, she said. Information she had received from Lynette's own mother, who had lived with the couple and witnessed it firsthand. Carly Aylesworth, Lynette's daughter, went further in her public statements. In an interview with Fox News, Carly alleged a history of threatening behavior by Brian toward her mother, including verbal threats about the water. She said the fact that Lynette disappeared the way Brian described made her believe there was more to the story. Brian's attorney, Terrell Butler, issued a clear and direct denial on his behalf. Butler stated that Brian categorically and unequivocally denied any wrongdoing, specifically including the allegations made by Carly Aylesworth. Brian himself released a written denial through his attorney saying he had retained counsel and was acting on strict legal advice. But the documented record, the text messages, the neighbor accounts, the daughter's public statements, painted a picture of a marriage that looked very different behind closed doors than it did on a social media feed. This is the relationship that Brian and Lynette brought onto that dinghy on the night of April 4th. Before we get to that night, there is something in Brian Hooker's history that is part of the documented public record. Not alleged. Not speculative. Documented through court files and police reports from the state of Michigan. In 2005, Kentwood, Michigan police received a report involving an incident at the Hooker home during a visit from Brian's children. The dispute reportedly began over an argument related to their homeschooling curriculum, specifically, instruction connected to creationism. During that dispute, an allegation was made involving Brian and one of the children in the home. A referral was made to the Michigan Family Independence Agency. Detective Michelle Clark with the Kentwood Police Department documented additional witness accounts and filed supplemental reports. That paperwork was submitted to the prosecutor's office. In 2006, a Kent County jury heard the case. Brian Hooker was acquitted. He was never convicted. That is a legal fact. In 2015, a separate incident is documented in Michigan court records. Both Brian and Lynette were involved. Both accused each other of assault that night. The warrant that followed was ultimately denied because authorities determined there was insufficient evidence to establish who had initiated the confrontation. No conviction resulted from that incident either. But the record of that 2015 incident includes a detail that became publicly significant once Lynette disappeared. According to Carly Aylesworth, speaking on the record to Fox News, that event was not isolated. She described a pattern of behavior that she said her mother had experienced over the course of the marriage. Brian denied all of it. His attorney has maintained that denial consistently and publicly throughout this investigation. Those denials are part of the record. So is everything else. Understanding how Brian and Lynette Hooker ended up on that small boat in the dark water of the Abaco Islands requires understanding how they got there, because it was not a sudden decision. It was years in the making. Their first sailing trip happened in July 2021. A relatively short run to Milwaukee. A test of the idea more than a true voyage. Something to see whether the dream of living on the water was actually a life they could build. Apparently, they decided it was. By January 2023, Brian and Lynette were in Rockport, Texas. They had spent, by Lynette's own description in a YouTube video they posted that month, years driving around the country, looking for the right boat. What they found in Rockport was a Morgan 461, a 46-foot sailboat originally built in 1980, a charter boat that had sailed out of the Virgin Islands. Lynette looked directly into the camera and described it as a little rough on the edges. She was smiling when she said it. They spent months repairing it, cleaning it, making it seaworthy. They named it the Soulmate. In March 2023, they filmed themselves leaving the Industrial Canal Lock on the Mississippi River, heading toward Lake Pontchartrain near New Orleans. Then they tried to cross the Gulf. Gale force winds stopped them before they made it. They turned back and waited in Morgan City, Louisiana. They tried again. By the time they were working their way through the Gulf in 2023, they were meeting people along the coast who were following their channel. A man named John Waters met them at an oyster bar in Panama City Beach, Florida, during that stretch of the trip. He told Fox News Digital that their whole identity had become the boat by that point. He described the couple as both really nice, two people going for what he called their retirement dream of sailing. He also said something else that did not get as much attention at the time. He said they were not that experienced. They were not lifelong sailors. They had not come up through years of offshore racing or blue water passages. They had bought a boat, spent a year fixing it, and pointed it south. Which was the dream. And it was also the context. By February 2026, Brian and Lynette had reached the Bahamas. They had been posting from Great Guana Cay, from Elbow Cay, from the waters around the Abaco Islands. On March 9, 2026, Lynette uploaded what would become the final video on the Sailing Hookers YouTube channel. 3 minutes of paddle boarding. Lynette pointing out wildlife in the water. Nothing to suggest what was coming. On March 29, she posted her last public words. Here we are at Marsh Harbor. The Sea of Abaco is very entertaining. 26 days later, she was gone. This is where the story splits into two versions. There is the version Brian Hooker told authorities. And there is what the data recorded. Here is Brian's version, as he told it to Bahamian police, as he described it in a recorded phone call on April 7, and as he relayed it to his friend Daniel Danforth the following morning in text messages. On the evening of April 4, 2026, Brian and Lynette Hooker had dinner and drinks at the Abaco Inn, a waterfront bar and restaurant in Hopetown, on Elbow Cay. According to Bahamian officials, they left the Abaco Inn at approximately 7:30 in the evening. That departure came 4 minutes after sunset that night. It was already getting dark. They boarded their 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy, a small motorized tender used to get from shore to the Soulmate, which was anchored out in Aunt Pat's Bay. A short distance. A ride. That took roughly 4 minutes in good conditions. A ride they had made before. Brian told police that conditions on the water that night were rough. High winds, he said. Choppy water. He described what happened next in a recorded phone call made to Blaine and Marnie Stevenson on April 7, a call that Blaine recorded because, in his own words, Brian was all over the place and Blaine wanted to document what he was saying. In that recording, Brian said Lynette basically just bounced off the dinghy. He described it as a little blow, around 20-knot winds that came up suddenly. He said the dinghy's ignition key went over the side with Lynette. She had the spare key in her dry bag, which went with her. Without the key, the engine was dead. He said the wind rapidly pushed them apart. He said he threw a flotation device toward her. He said he yelled. He said he lost sight of her. He said neither of them was wearing a life jacket that night. In text messages to his friend Daniel Danforth the following morning, Brian wrote, "The wind blew me away from her and she swam towards the sailboat." He said he had drifted and tried to paddle with one oar for the next 7 hours. He said he fired 2 distress flares into the dark. He said 2 separate boats passed him. Neither one responded. Eventually, Brian Hooker washed ashore on a rocky beach adjacent to the Marsh Harbor boatyards, approximately 4 miles northeast of where he said the incident had occurred. A security guard named Edward Smith was working the overnight shift at the boatyards that night. A colleague alerted him that a man had stumbled onto the property. Smith found Brian on the beach. He described him to Fox News Digital as exhausted and asking for water. Smith asked Brian directly where the woman was. Brian told him she was in the water. Smith asked what time it had happened. Brian said around 7 in the evening. And Smith's response, which he described later, was essentially, from 7. And you are only just reaching the shore now? Brian told Smith the wind had been blowing so strong that when it happened, the boat blew away from him and he could not see in the dark. Smith called the police. Officers arrived at approximately 5 o'clock in the morning on April 5. Brian was still speaking with them when Smith's shift ended at 7 a.m. That morning, Brian left a voicemail for Carly Aylesworth. The voicemail, which was later shared with CNN, was Brian telling Carly that Hopetown Search and Rescue had found the flotation device he said he had thrown toward Lynette when she went overboard. Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, later confirmed to reporters that Lynette's Apple Watch had also been recovered somewhere in those waters. The flotation device. The Apple Watch. Recovered. Lynette Hooker, not recovered. The Royal Bahamas Police Force, the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, and the U.S. Coast Guard mobilized search operations immediately. Shoreline patrols. Aerial drone surveillance. Submersible drone operations. Sea patrols across the areas Brian had identified as relevant to that night. Richard Cook, the team leader with Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue, told People magazine in the early days of the search that they were dealing with a difficult set of conditions. That night. No moon, he said. Pitch dark. Very windy. Rough conditions for the size of the boat they were on. A local contact who knew the Hookers and their dinghy told Fox News Digital something more direct. He said that 8-foot hard-bottom dinghy with an electric motor was not suited for those conditions. You should not be out in anything above 12 to 15 knots on a vessel that Size, he said. He called it underpowered and undersized for what Brian described. John Waters, who had met the couple the year before in Florida, had also said on the record that they were not that experienced on the water. The searches in April found nothing. Not one physical trace of Lynette Hooker. And that absence, that complete and total absence of any sign of her, was the detail that began pulling investigators toward a different set of questions altogether. A search and rescue dog is deployed when investigators believe a living person might still be found. Time is critical. Speed matters. The goal is recovery of someone who may still be alive. A cadaver detection dog is deployed when that question is no longer the operative one. These animals are trained to detect specific chemical signals produced by the human body after death, signals that can persist in water, in soil, in enclosed spaces, in conditions where all other evidence has long since disappeared. Their presence in an investigation signals that the investigators sending them no longer believe they are looking for a survivor. Maggie is the second kind. She had been deployed in April during the original search. She worked the areas that Brian Hooker's account had directed investigators toward, the east side, the locations his story had made relevant. She found nothing. Because, as the GPS data would later confirm, those were not the right locations. The first search was not a failure of Maggie. It was a failure of the map. And the map had been built on a story. This time, the map came directly from the GPS data on Brian's phone. Search teams from the U.S. Coast Guard, joined by the Royal Bahamas Police Force and the Royal Bahamas Defense Force, moved northwest toward Lubbers Quarters Cay. Toward an abandoned boat harbor in that area. Toward the remote coastline along the northwest side of the Abaco Cays, coastline that is dark at night, that sees almost no traffic, that is reachable by an 8-foot dinghy and nothing else. The Bahamian government had formally granted U.S. investigators permission to search those waters. Permission was required because this was Bahamian territorial jurisdiction. The formal request, the formal approval, that exchange between two governments is itself a marker of how seriously this investigation had developed. During this same period, investigators made a request of Lynette's family. They asked Carly Aylesworth and Lynette's parents to provide DNA samples, mouth swabs, submitted to investigators to assist in the identification process. DNA collection at this stage of a missing persons case that has become a homicide. Investigation is standard procedure for one reason: investigators are preparing for the possibility that they will locate remains and will need to confirm identity. The family complied. Carly told ABC News simply, "She has to be somewhere." She said all the help they could get was greatly appreciated. On June 4, 2026, one day after Maggie arrived in the Bahamas, federal authorities took custody of the dinghy. The 8-foot hard-bottom vessel that Brian Hooker says was the last place Lynette was ever seen alive was transported from Bahamian custody to the United States for further forensic examination. The seizure was confirmed by Fox News Digital and CNN. The forensic significance of the dinghy is specific and it is significant. Certain biological markers can persist inside an enclosed vessel long after exposure to water, weather, and the passage of time. These markers are not visible to the naked eye. They are not detectable through standard visual inspection or camera review. They cannot be found by a person walking through and looking. But a trained detection dog working inside a confined space, under controlled conditions, with time to work, operates at a level of sensitivity that no human inspection can approach. Maggie was in the Bahamas. The dinghy was now in federal hands. Together, those two facts represent the most consequential forensic development in this investigation since the night of April 4 itself. On June 8, 2026, the U.S. Coast Guard issued a statement. The search in the Bahamas had concluded. In that statement, the agency confirmed it had deployed diverse, underwater vehicles, drones, and a cadaver dog to thoroughly examine what they described as newly identified areas of interest. The underwater vehicles included remotely operated systems capable of reaching depths and angles that human divers could not safely access. A Coast Guard spokesperson declined to comment on what the search produced. The investigation, they confirmed, remains active and ongoing. They said information would be released as it became available. The CAIS, the Coast Guard Investigative Service, issued a public appeal. Anyone with information about the disappearance of Lynette Hooker was urged to submit a tip directly through the CAIS Tips app. What Maggie found. What the divers recovered. What the underwater vehicles captured. None of it has been made public. The federal criminal investigation is open. Lynette Hooker has not been found. Closing. Lynette Hooker built a life before the boat. She built a career across decades, working her way through multiple companies in an industry that required skill and commitment to navigate. She raised a daughter. She maintained relationships with her mother, with her friends, with the people in her community who described her as warm and genuine and present. And then she made a decision. She quit her job. She sold her house. She gave away everything she had accumulated. She did all of that to go sailing with Brian Hooker. On March 29, 2026, she pointed her camera at the water and wrote that the Sea of Abaco was very entertaining. On April 4, 2026, she got on a small boat in the dark and did not come back. Her daughter Carly has not spoken to Brian Hooker since the day after Lynette disappeared. She said publicly that if she could say anything to her mother right now, it would be, "I just hope you are still out there." Her mother Darlene is still going through text messages. Still reviewing YouTube videos. Still trying to help. The GPS data is in federal hands. Both boats have been seized. The DNA samples are on file. The FBI laboratory in Quantico is processing evidence. The Coast Guard Investigative Service has an open criminal investigation with no public end date. And somewhere in the Sea of Abaco, or in the forensic record that investigators are still building, there are answers. Lynette Hooker deserves them. If you know anything about the disappearance of Lynette Hooker, you can submit a tip through the CAIS Tips app. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you do not miss any further developments in this case as they come in. And share this with someone who needs to know this story.